No river should be able to do this. No desert should be able to feed a nation. But 5,000 years ago, on a strip of land surrounded by nothing but sand, one of the most advanced civilizations in human history was born. Not in a fertile valley, not in a forest. In a desert so dry, so unforgiving, that almost nothing should have survived here. And yet, out of this wasteland came pyramids that still stand. Cities that fed millions. A calendar system so precise, modern scientists still study it. How does a civilization rise in a place designed to kill it? The answer isn't luck. It's not magic. It's a story of timing, risk, and a river that behaved in a way no one could predict. Every year it flooded on schedule. Every year it left behind soil rich enough to grow an empire. But that gift came with a warning. Too little flooding and the crops failed. Too much and entire villages disappeared underwater. For centuries, survival depended on reading the river correctly. One miscalculation could mean famine. One flood at the wrong time could mean death. So how did early Egyptians turn this unstable, unpredictable environment into the foundation of one of the greatest civilizations in history? And what happened when the river they depended on started to change? Before Egypt, there was only the Nile, a single thread of water cutting through a stretch of desert bigger than most countries. On either side, nothing but heat and dust for hundreds of miles. Early settlers who arrived here faced a brutal choice. Stay close to the river or risk death in the open sand. But staying close carried its own danger, because the Nile didn't behave like other rivers. It didn't flow steadily. It didn't stay within predictable lines. Once a year, without warning signs, modern science would recognize it rose. Slowly at first, then fast. Fields disappeared under brown water. Homes built too close were swallowed whole. For a farmer standing on the riverbank, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifying. One year, the flood came exactly as expected, and the soil left behind was perfect for planting. The next year, passing knowledge from father to son, it wasn't science yet. Crops failed, grain stores emptied, families went hungry. No one understood why the river changed its behavior from one year to the next. There were no meteorologists, no satellites, no way to track rainfall 1,000 miles upstream in the highlands of a country they didn't even know existed. All they had was observation, memory, and fear. So early communities did something remarkable. They started watching the river like their lives depended on it. Because they did. They began marking water levels on stone, recording patterns, passing knowledge from father to son. It wasn't science yet, but it was the beginning of something civilizations would later depend on completely. And what they discovered next would change everything. Because the Nile wasn't just unpredictable, it was sending a signal, and almost no one alive at the time knew how to read it. The signal was there, but almost no one could see it. Because the answer wasn't in Egypt at all. It was over 1,000 miles away, in the highlands of a distant country, where seasonal rains fell on mountains the early Egyptians had never seen. Those rains fed rivers that fed the Nile, which meant the flood in Egypt wasn't decided in Egypt. It was decided somewhere else entirely, by weather no one on the riverbank could predict or control. To a farmer watching the water rise, that must have felt like fate, like the river had a will of its own. But few observers began noticing something strange. Right before the flood arrived each year, a single star appeared on the horizon just before dawn. The same star, the same timing, almost every single year. At first, it seemed like coincidence. But coincidence doesn't repeat for generations. Officials and early priests started tracking it, comparing it against flood records stretching back decades. The pattern held. When the star appeared, the flood followed, almost like clockwork. This wasn't magic. It wasn't prophecy. It was one of the earliest recorded links between astronomy and agriculture in human history. And it gave Egypt something no other desert civilization had: a warning system. A way to prepare before disaster struck instead of reacting after it already had. But knowing the flood was coming solved only half the problem. Because the real danger wasn't the water itself. It was what happened in the years the pattern broke. And soon it would. For generations, the pattern held. Long enough that people began to trust it completely. Officials built entire systems around it. Grain storage, labor schedules, even religious festivals timed to the river's rhythm. The Nile wasn't just a water source anymore. It had become the calendar, the economy, and the belief system of an entire civilization. Then, in a year no different from any other, the star appeared right on schedule. But the flood didn't. At first, officials assumed it was late. A delay, nothing more. Farmers waited. The riverbanks stayed dry. Days turned into weeks. Soil that should have been soaked and fertile stayed cracked and lifeless. Panic spread quietly at first, then louder. If the flood failed completely, there would be no harvest. No harvest meant no grain. No grain meant starvation on a scale no official wanted to say out loud. Workers who managed the grain stores began rationing in secret, terrified of what would happen if the public found out how low supplies actually were. Soldiers were quietly repositioned near storage sites, not for war, for control in case desperate crowds turned violent. Officials who once celebrated the river's predictability now stood on the banks in silence, watching for any sign of movement in the water. Then, weeks later than ever recorded, the flood finally came. Weaker, shorter, barely enough to cover the fields. It saved the region from immediate collapse. But it also revealed something far more dangerous. The river Egypt had trusted completely could fail. And if it failed once, it could fail again. The question was no longer if, it was when. That single failed flood changed everything. Officials could no longer afford to just watch the river and hope. They needed a system that could survive a bad year. So engineers were brought in. Men who spent their lives studying stone, water, and pressure. Their task was almost impossible. Control a river too massive to stop, using tools that were still primitive by any modern standard. Their first attempts were small. Basins carved into the earth near the riverbanks, designed to catch and hold floodwater instead of letting it rush past. It worked, but barely. One heavy flood season cracked an entire basin wall overnight. Workers rushed in at dawn to find fields flooded that were never supposed to touch water at all. Some crops were saved. Others were destroyed within hours. The lesson was brutal but clear. Small fixes wouldn't be enough, so the scale increased. Canals were dug by hand, stretching for miles, redirecting water to fields that had never received it naturally. Thousands of laborers worked under brutal sun, some collapsing from exhaustion, others injured by collapsing trenches. This wasn't a peaceful farming story anymore. It was a large-scale operation organized like a military campaign because in many ways it was one. A campaign against nature itself. Slowly, the results started to show. More land became farmable. Grain surpluses grew for the first time in years. But with more water control came a new problem no one saw coming. Because the more they reshaped the river's natural path, the more the land itself began to change in ways nobody expected. Fields that once flooded naturally now stayed dry for longer stretches. Soil that had always renewed itself began showing signs of exhaustion in certain areas. In some regions, salt began rising to the surface, left behind after years of controlled irrigation instead of natural flooding. Farmers noticed white patches spreading across ground that used to be black and rich. At first, they thought it was dust. Then they realized nothing would grow there anymore. Officials faced a decision no one wanted to make. Keep expanding the canal systems and risk damaging more land. Or slow down and risk losing the food surplus that now supported cities, temples, and a growing population. They chose balance. Engineers began rotating which basins were used each season, letting some land rest while the river reclaimed it naturally. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it worked well enough to hold the system together. Over generations, this careful, constantly adjusted relationship between river and human effort became the backbone of Egyptian civilization. Not a gift from nature, not luck. A system built through failure, correction, and hard-earned observation, refined by men who had no guarantee it would work at all. The pyramids came later, the temples, the writing, the empire. All of it stood on a foundation most visitors never think about. A desert that shouldn't have supported life. A river that could turn from savior to threat within a single season. And a civilization that learned to survive not by controlling nature completely, but by learning to live inside its risk. That balance lasted for thousands of years, until forces far beyond Egypt's control began to shift the river once again. But that is a story for another day. If you want to understand how far human ingenuity can go against nature itself, consider subscribing for more stories like this one.